Very few countries were against each other as much as Egypt and Iran were throughout the 1950s and 1960s. This video will explain the grievances of Egypt to Iran and those of Iran to Egypt, and the period of change until 1980. If this is your first time on the channel and you want a credible source of information on Egyptian politics, Middle Eastern politics, or global politics in general, you can subscribe and click the notification bell so you don't miss out on anything. I put all scholarly and non-scholarly sources cited APA style in the description below. Egypt's grievances to Iran. The problems between Egypt and Iran revolved primarily around the objectives of President Gamal Abdel Nasser. He came to power after overthrowing Egypt's King Farouk with the ideology of secular Arab nationalism. Secular Arab nationalism meant that Nasser had the goal of opposing monarchies and governance based on religion. For Iran, this strained relations because the country was under the rule of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who was the absolute monarch of the country. Nasser also wanted to unite the Arab world. If we count every country that designates Arabic as an official language as an Arab country, then that would mean he wanted to create one of the world's largest empires, stretching from Iran itself to the Atlantic Ocean and covering over 20 sovereign nations. What made Nasser a potential threat to the Iranians, however, was not just his stated desires, but also the popularity he had and how there was a real possibility he could achieve these goals. On top of being insanely popular and loved by Arabs throughout the 20 aforementioned countries, Nasser was also taking action. He was actively supporting Algerian fighters against the French. He successfully took the Suez Canal from the British. He sent troops to fight against the monarchy in Yemen in 1962, and in 1958, he united Egypt with Syria to create the United Arab Republic. That same year, a coup d'etat in Iraq, inspired by Nasser, overthrew the Iraqi king and created another secular Arab republic which had the nationalist idea of uniting the Arab world and opposing monarchies. Unlike Egypt, Syria, and Yemen, however, Iraq was right on Iran's border. The Iranians were afraid of this for several reasons. First of all, is that an empire that big on Iran's western border would have certainly been a massive threat to the Iranian state, especially if it had any expansionist desires. More than that, however, Iran itself has an Arabic-speaking region called Khuzestan. According to a CIA research document completed in 1980, about two-thirds of the people living there were Arabs, many of them having strong relations with the other Arab communities in Iraq and the Gulf. The document also explained how, although they are a minority, the Persians have most of the power in the province, which caused a bit of resentment from the Arab side. If that wasn't spicy enough, Khuzestan produces roughly 70% of all Iran's oil, as well as most of its natural gas. For the rest of Iran, Nasser encouraging the overthrow of monarchies and the unification of the Arab world was a threat to the imperial state of Iran, both politically and economically. First of all, politically, because it could mean the end of Shah Pahlavi's rule, as well as any other Shah or king that came after him, in addition to the breakup of an Iranian province which could spark other non-Persian Iranian provinces to break up, such as the area where the Kurds and Azeris live. Second of all, economically, because the oil industry made up a significant portion of Iran's economy. Even if it didn't account for most of the government's revenue, its loss would be damaging. This was without mentioning the biggest threat Iran actually faced, which wasn't Nasser, Egypt, or the Arabs, but the Russians. The Soviet Union was Iran's biggest land border, and they had one of the largest militaries, nuclear arsenals, and potent ideologies. Not too unlike Nasser, communism was also against monarchies. Going one step further than Nasser, however, communism was popular on a global level, and had the military backing of the USSR. Whereas the Egyptian threat was still only potential, the Soviet Union had actually occupied Iran during World War II alongside the British. When the British left, the Russians remained and only left after facing a lot of international pressure. The threat Iran faced from the Soviet Union is important to note in relation to Egypt because it made Nasser's goals of unifying the Arab world and overthrowing monarchies that much more threatening. The Iranians already had to deal with a superpower like that from the north. To face another one from the west would have made things way more difficult, especially considering the close ties Nasser had to the USSR, such as Soviet military sales not just to Egypt, but also Nasser-inspired Egyptian allies like Syria. Iran's grievances towards Egypt. In response to Nasser, the Iranians had to come up with a plan that would protect their interests, and that plan was pretty easy actually. It was called Ally with America. Technically, in the beginning, Egypt and Iran didn't actually have terrible relations. In 1952, after the Egyptian Revolution, the United States was shoring up support against the USSR and accepted Egypt's post-revolutionary rulers and gave them funding for things like the Aswan Dam. At the same time, Iran was trying to not get invaded by the USSR, its massive neighbor to the north, who had turned Eastern Europe into a dictatorial playground. For such reasons, it allied with the United States primarily through massive weapon sales. Iran also allied with the United Kingdom alongside Pakistan, Iraq, and Turkey, primarily to defend against the USSR. Their alliance was called several names, such as the Baghdad Pact, CENTO, or what we will call it, MITO, the Middle East Treaty Organization. It was essentially a Middle Eastern NATO, to which America was an observer member. Although the United States had wanted to eventually include Egypt in some type of Middle Eastern alliance, most likely to protect the Suez Canal from Soviet influence, according to then Prime Minister Mohammad Naguib, the Soviet Union had promised Egypt massive security aid if they stayed out of Western alliances. Regardless of whether or not this is true, it eventually led the American ambassador to Egypt to send a message to the country that Egypt will not take part in the MITO alliance. Iran, meanwhile, stayed on the team, being one of the most important players of it. Egypt's opposition to the MITO alliance only grew, however, when Nasser officially became the president of Egypt, because the alliance had positioned Iraq to be the center of the Arab world, which Nasser was staunchly opposed to. Aside from the fact that Iraq was not Egypt, and therefore wasn't ruled by Nasser, it was an absolute monarchy. Nasser also didn't appreciate the close ties those nations had with the United States and the United Kingdom, which served them in defending against the USSR. To Nasser's benefit, the alliance wouldn't last, but Iran would continue to be one of America's most important allies on the planet, purchasing massive amounts of weapons and having one of the largest militaries on the planet. All of this was happening while relations between Egypt and the United States continued to deteriorate. Iran also maintained relations with Israel, which may have been a counterbalance against Nasser's ideologies. After the Six-Day War, Iran was in a relatively advantageous position in relation to Egypt. In 1962, Syria left Egypt because the unification wasn't working out. At the same time, throughout the 1960s, Egypt was stuck fighting against the monarchists in Yemen, which kept the Egyptian military distracted and eventually helped in its disastrous defeat to the Israeli military in 1967, which lasted the Sinai Peninsula. By this point, Nasser resigned in failure, but the people liked him so much, he unresigned. Even though he remained in office, he failed to unify the Arab world several times, lost Sinai and half the Suez Canal, and the country was severely weakened. The threat of Arab nationalism was not as big anymore, which was a positive for Iran. Egypt's military was also weakened, another positive for Iran since it could no longer support Arab nationalist forces the same way it used to. It could then focus on its relationship with America and containing the Soviet Union. 1970 to 1982. During this time, Egypt was struggling. It was in a slow war of attrition with Israel. The economy had decreased, and the Soviet Union wasn't being particularly helpful. Nasser relied on them for military aid against the war of attrition in the Suez Canal against the Israelis, but they did not respond. Whether or not this was a factor why, Nasser died in 1970 at the relatively young age of 50 due to a heart attack. The new Egyptian president, Anwar al-Sadat, in coordination with Syria, launched a military campaign in 1973 to take back the Sinai Peninsula, which proved somewhat successful. While they fought, Arab oil producers in the Gulf embargoed shipments to countries supportive of Israel, like the United States. Even though Iran did not join them in embargoing oil, they ordered for higher prices, which did not help America either. For several reasons, including the geopolitical environment of the 1970s, Egypt slowly turned away from the USSR and became a closer ally to the United States. This culminated in the Camp David Accords in 1978 and the liberation of Sinai. For a brief period, Egypt and Iran were on the same side, until the Islamic Revolution occurred. When the Shah fled Iran in 1979, he went to Egypt and after jumping around several countries, was granted asylum by Sadat to stay in Egypt, where he died and where his tomb remains to this day. Egypt also established diplomatic ties to Israel as part of the Camp David Accords. Iran, under the new fundamentalist Islamist government, did not really like this, and severed diplomatic ties with Egypt. While Egypt wasn't ruled by Nasser anymore, and wasn't necessarily anti-monarchist, and didn't have the stated goal of uniting the entire Arab world, it was still opposed to the type of religious fundamentalism the new Islamist Iranian government had come out with. Egypt, in addition to many other countries in the world, was afraid that their fundamentalism would spread to other Muslim countries. For that reason, Egypt supported Iraq after Saddam invaded Iran in 1980, because Iran being at war meant it was weakened and bogged down, and that the revolution might not be successful, therefore preventing the proliferation of fundamentalism. Sadat was eventually assassinated by a fundamentalist Islamist group called Egyptian-Islamic Jihad. Iran then named a street in Tehran after the name of Sadat's assassin, Khalid al-Islambuli, solidifying it as a sort of screw you to the Egyptians. In conclusion, Egypto-Iranian relations haven't been the best, and the two sides have found themselves on opposite ends of international disputes due to the rise of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and the Cold War. If you found this video useful, don't forget to check out my other video explaining what Egypt's opinion on the Taiwan crisis is. There's also another video explaining how the Ukraine war has affected Egypt and what Egypt's role in the Ukraine war is. Thank you for watching.